The coffee shop went dead silent when the biker's fist smashed the table, spilling coffee across the old man's book. "Get out of my seat, cripple," he growled, towering over the one-armed veteran who didn't flinch. Nobody moved, not the waitress, not the customers, not even the air. But in the corner, a young man in a baseball cap looked up, his eyes sharp as steel. To the bikers, he was just another nobody sipping a latte. What they didn't know, what nobody in that small-town diner could have guessed, was that the guy in jeans was a tomb guard, trained to honor the fallen and protect the living. And in the next 60 seconds, those 5 bikers would learn exactly what kind of man they just crossed. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. The sun hung low over the small Virginia town, casting a golden glow through the wide windows of the Brew, a cozy coffee shop just a few miles from Arlington National Cemetery. It was a Sunday morning, 8 a.m., and the place buzzed with the gentle hum of a weekend crowd. The air smelled of freshly ground coffee beans, warm pastries, and a hint of cinnamon. Behind the counter, the espresso machine hissed and gurgled while the clink of ceramic mugs and the soft murmur of conversation filled the room. Black and white photos lined the walls, snapshots of the town's history, from 1950s Main Street to local boys in uniform heading off to wars long past. One faded picture near the register showed a young Marine in Vietnam, his face set with quiet determination. Most folks didn't give it a second glance, but the regulars knew who it was. Ray Thompson, or Pops as the locals called him, sat in his usual spot by the window, a worn paperback about World War II open in front of him. At 68, Ray was a fixture at the Brew, showing up every Sunday morning like clockwork. His silver hair was neatly combed, his flannel shirt tucked in, and a small Marine Corps pin gleamed on his jacket. His left sleeve was pinned up just below the elbow, a quiet reminder of the arm he'd lost to a grenade in Vietnam back in 1970. Ray's eyes, sharp and blee, scanned the pages of his book, but his posture was alert, like he was still ready for anything. Old habits from his Marine days never faded. Across the room, Daniel Rivera, Lieutenant Dan Rivera to his unit, sat at a corner table blending in with the crowd. At 32, Dan was a tomb guard at Arlington, one of the elite soldiers who stood watch over the tomb of the unknown soldier. Today was his day off, and he traded his crisp dress blues for a black t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low. His laptop was open, emails from work half read, but his attention kept drifting to the familiar rhythm of the coffee shop. Dan knew Ray from a veterans event a few months back, where the older man's stories of Vietnam had left an impression. They'd nodded to each other when Dan walked in, a quiet acknowledgement between men who understood service. Lena Harper, the 50-year-old owner of the Brew, moved between tables, her brown hair tied back in a messy bun, her apron stained with years of hard work. She flashed a warm smile at a couple of college kids studying in the corner, then stopped by Ray's table with a fresh pot of coffee. "Morning, Pops," she said, her voice carrying a soft Virginia jaw. "Refill?" Ray glanced up, his face creasing into a small smile. "You know I can't say no to that, Lena. Keep it coming." She poured the black coffee, careful not to spill on his book. "Reading about the war again? You ever take a break from that stuff?" "History keeps you honest," Rai said, his voice low and steady. "Keeps you from forgetting what matters." Lena chuckled, shaking her head. "You're a stubborn one, Pops." She moved on to the next table, where an older couple shared a plate of blueberry muffins, their conversation a soft hum about grandkids and gardening. Dan sipped his latte, his eyes flicking to Ray. He admired the old man's quiet strength, the way he carried himself despite the missing arm. Ray reminded Dan of the soldiers he honored every day at Arlington, men and women who'd given everything and asked for nothing. He was about to go back to his emails when the roar of motorcycle engines shook the windows, loud and aggressive, like thunder rolling through the quiet morning. The door swung open and 5 men strode in, their heavy boots thumping against the hardwood floor. The leader, Jake Malone, known as Razor to his crew, was a mountain of a man, 6'4" with a shaved head and tattoos snaking up his arms. His leather jacket creaked as he moved, and a sneer curled his lip. We other four, Tommy, Spike, Mitch, and Carl, followed close behind, their eyes scanning the room like predators. They were part of the Iron Reapers, a biker gang that had been causing trouble around town for weeks. Conversations in the coffee shop trailed off, forks paused mid-bite, and the college kids in the corner shrank in their seats. Jake's gaze landed on Ray's table by the window, the best spot in the house, with a clear view of the street. He smirked and walked over, his boots loud against the floor. "Hey, old man," he said, his voice carrying across the shop. "You're in my seat. Move it." Ray looked up from his book, his blue eyes calm but unflinching. He set the paperback down slowly, folding the corner of the page. "I've been sitting here every Sunday for 10 years, son," he said, his voice steady with a faint Ohio twang. "Plenty of tables. Pick another." Jake's smirk faded, his face reddening. The other bikers exchanged glances, shifting closer. "Deaf or just stupid?" Jake said, louder now, drawing every eye in the room. "This is my table now. Get up or I'll drag you out of here." The shop went dead silent. The older couple stared at their muffins, the college kids froze, and Lena gripped the coffee pot tighter. Ray stared at the spilled coffee, then at the pin on the floor. His cheek twitched, but he didn't move. He'd been through too much in his life. Jungles, gunfire, the blast that took his arm, to let a punk like Jake shake him. He thought of Vietnam, the friends he'd lost, the promises he'd made to keep going. He wasn't about to let some loudmouth biker take that from him. Across the room, Dan closed his laptop with a soft click. He'd been watching, listening, his body tense but his face calm. He knew Ray, not well, but enough to respect him. He'd heard the old man's stories at that veterans event a few months back, stories of courage, of carrying wounded men to safety, of surviving when the odds were against him. Dan's jaw tightened as he saw the pin on the floor, the spilled coffee. The way Jake loomed over Ray, like a bully picking on the weakest kid in the yard. He stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked toward Ray's table, his steps measured but purposeful. "Hey," Jake said, noticing Dan for the first time. "What's this? You got a problem, buddy?" Dan stopped a few feet away, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes locked on Jake. "Yeah, I do," he said, his voice calm but firm with a slight Texas draw. "You're messing with a man who doesn't deserve it. Pick up his pen, apologize, and walk away." Jake laughed, glancing at his crew. "Hear that, boys? This guy thinks he's a hero." He stepped closer to Dan, towering over him. "Who the hell are you anyway? Some wannabe tough guy?" Dan didn't blink. "Just someone who knows right from wrong. Pick up the pen, Jake. Last chance." The other bikers laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. Tommy, a wiry guy with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "You're out of your league, man. Back off before you get hurt." Dan's eyes flicked to Tommy, then back to Jake. "I'm not the one who's going to get hurt," he said, "but I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Jake's grin vanished. He swung a meaty fist at Dan's face, fast and heavy, expecting to end the conversation right there. But Dan was faster. He sidestepped, grabbing Jake's wrist and twisting it in a smooth practice motion. Jake grunted in pain, his arm locked behind him, and Dan shoved him forward, sending him crashing into a table. Cups and plates shattered, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet shop. Tommy and Spike lunged at Dan from either side, their fists raised. Dan moved like he'd been trained for this, because he had. As a tomb guard, he'd spent years honing his body and mind, and his close quarters combat training kicked in like muscle memory. He ducked under Tommy's wild swing, driving an elbow into the man's ribs, then spun and caught Spike's arm, twisting it until Spike dropped to his knees with a yelp. In one fluid motion, Dan kicked a chair into Mitch's path as he charged, sending the biker stumbling into Carl. The two crashed into the counter, knocking over a stack of coffee mugs. The fight was over in less than a minute. Jake was sprawled across the broken table, groaning. Tommy clutched his side, gasping for air. Spike was on his knees, his arms still twisted in Dan's grip. Mitch and Carl scrambled to their feet, but one look at Dan's steady gaze stopped them cold. The shop was silent, except for the sound of shattered ceramic settling on the floor and the heavy breathing of the bikers. Dan released Spike's arm and stepped back, his stance relaxed but ready. "Pick up the pin," he said again, his voice low and even, "and apologize to Ray." Now Jake struggled to his feet, his face red with humiliation. He glanced at his crew, but they looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes. "Fine," he muttered, limping over to the counter where the marine pin lay. He picked it up, his hands shaking, and set it on Ray's table. "Sorry," he mumbled, barely audible. "Didn't mean no harm." Dan shook his head. "Louder and mean it." Jake swallowed hard, his pride in tatters. "I'm sorry." "Okay," he said, his voice clearer now. "I shouldn't have done that." He pulled a crumpled wad of bills from his pocket and tossed them on the table, for the coffee and the mess. Ray looked at the pin, then at Jake. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. "Respect ain't something you take, son. It's something you earn. You might want to work on that." Jake nodded, his bravado gone. He motioned to his crew, and they shuffled toward the door, their boots scuffing the floor. The roar of their motorcycles filled the air as they sped away, leaving the shop in stunned silence. Then the applause started. The older couple stood clapping loudly, the man calling out, "Semper Fi, Ray!" The college kids joined in, their faces lit with awe. Lena rushed over, her hands clasped together, tears in her eyes. "Oh my God, Ray! Dan, are you okay?" she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't know what to do." Ray smiled, patting her hand. "We're fine, Lena. You run a good place here. Don't let a few punks ruin it." Dan slid into the chair across from Ray, his heart still pounding from the fight. "You all right, Pops?" he asked, his voice soft. Ray nodded, picking up his pin and wiping it clean with his napkin. He pinned it back on his jacket, his hands steady despite the adrenaline. "Been through worse," he said, "but I appreciate you stepping in, Dan. Didn't know you had that kind of fight in you." Dan grinned, a rare break in his serious demeanor. "Guess I've had some practice." He hesitated, then added, "I'm a tomb guard over at Arlington. Didn't want to make a big deal of it, but I couldn't let them treat you like that." Ray's eyes widened slightly, then softened. "A tomb guard, huh? That's something." He paused, his voice dropping. "Reminds me of the boys I served with in Nam. Young, tough, full of heart. You did them proud today." Dan felt a warmth in his chest, the kind that came not from praise, but from knowing he'd done right. "I just did what you'd have done, Pops, what any of us would do for a brother." Lena, still shaken, brought over a fresh pot of coffee. "On the house," she said firmly, "for both of you. And don't even think about paying for those broken mugs. That's on Jake." The older man from the couple approached, his hand extended. "I'm a vet myself," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Korea, 52. You two showed that punk what a real man looks like." He shook Ray's hand, then Dan's, his grip firm. "Thank you." Word of the incident spread fast. By the next week, the brew was busier than ever, with locals stopping by to hear the story firsthand. Lena framed a photo of Ray and Dan taken that morning by one of the college kids and hung it on the wall, calling it the Honor Corner. The shop became a gathering place for veterans who started showing up on Sundays to swap stories over coffee. Ray and Dan became regulars together, their table by the window, a quiet symbol of what they'd stood for.
Ray replaced his coffee-stained book with a new one, but he kept the marine pen polished and gleaming. Dan, for his part, found himself looking forward to those Sunday mornings, not just for the coffee, but for the stories Ray told. Stories of jungles and sacrifice, of men who'd stood their ground no matter the odds. And every time Dan walked into the brew, he felt a little taller knowing he'd honored not just the unknown soldier, but the man sitting across from him, a hero in his own right. As the weeks turned into months, the brew became more than a coffee shop. It was a place where the town came together, where veterans, young and old, found a home, where courage and respect weren't just words, but a way of life. And for Dan, it was a reminder that duty didn't end when the uniform came off. It lived in moments like these, in standing up for what was right, even when the odds were against you. If you enjoyed the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more stories like this. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear another story that's just as powerful and captivating, with courage, sacrifice, and a choice that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about duty and justice. Click on the video.